T, and then the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IJA, at $1.2 trillion with a T. We're talking about almost $3.1 trillion that are about to be and have been released to be invested in communities. And in that moment, when the ARA bill, that's what it was called, when it was passed, the administration at that time, the Obama administration, had 6 years to spend down $800 billion. And in this moment, the Biden administration has both the $3.1 trillion between ARPA, IJA, and now the Inflation Reduction Act, which adds an additional several billions of dollars into the pool of resources. And the reality is that Congress did not allocate a commitment to really further advance the needle on racial equity, on climate, in an intentional way. And so it means that we have to really think about how we encourage governments at each level to really think about this level of investment. Asali, who is the executive director of the Ashe Center, came here and asked how many people were thinking about the infrastructure funding, and we were kind of silent. And that's a problem in part because if we don't truly ensure that the values of the funding as it comes down from the federal to the state are not incorporating or being accountable to our values, it means on the back end, we'll have to be advocating for these issues decades down the line. And that's often what the case is. And that's why this conversation is so critical for us to have in this moment and in this opportunity. So I wanted to start just as an icebreaker to have you all really start to answer the question, what does equitable development and equitable transformation looks like in this moment? This morning, Spark released the Getting to Equitable Transformation Guide, which shared lessons on ARPA at the time. And a part of this is really because of the work that Melissa Jones from Bar-High had been part of, the Bay Area Health and Equities Initiative, and Dea from Denver participated in. And also we had an amazing consultant who helped to capture the stories, and that's what got released. But we wanted to bring it home today to really have a conversation of how that might happen. And so I wanted to start more specifically, Jenny, with some of the work that you all have been doing to really highlight what the conversation has been when we talk about equitable investment in communities and the accountability that needs to be part of it.
Well, can you all hear me? Okay, great. Hello. Don't give me a mic if you don't want me to talk in it. Some things to start with. SEEP, who are we? The Southern Economic Advancement Project was started in 2019 as a response to all this policy that's coming down, and how do you translate it to the South, right? Southern conversations are real different, and a lot of y'all not from the South. You already can tell too from the food. Where's my boy Sean? He loves the food here. He knows what I'm talking about. And it's a different experience, right? From everything, from exposure to conversations about intentionality. So when it comes to the ARP funds, SEEP had to take a shift in everything. 2020 obviously shook all of us, and we went from a focus on the 12 Southern states to now being an actual resource to the Treasury Department on how our toolkit, located at .org, would help other cities implement model resolution that would be, I don't think this is working anymore. It's working. Okay. Model resolution that would be used for cities across the South so that they can implement some of these conversations, particularly when it comes to equity, right? And thinking about the 4 phases that we talk about in terms of equity frameworks. Are organizations, our cities, our leaders actually framing their work in this idea of being equitable, right? Or is it still just certain groups that they're focusing on? Also in the phase 2, equity and engagement. How are we actually seeing these engagement processes happen? Are you inviting everybody to the table? That's one of the main conversations we've had earlier. We can't keep saying we're gonna be there for the people if you're not bringing the people into the space. And particularly when it comes to organizations that are in rural areas, right? A lot of things happen in big cities. A lot of money moves in big cities, but we also have very small cities and very small places that really need that support as well. And going into phase 3, equity in selecting and implementing projects. Are we allowing for everybody to apply for these particular projects and ideas? Are we promoting that? And when it comes to accountability, are we calling them out, right? And are we giving the tools to our advocates and our organizers to say, yes, we do need to see this money going into our communities and not solely for government spending that doesn't actually speak that they're giving it only to the police force, right? Like, we need to be holding them accountable. And if equity is going to be equitable, it needs to be intentional as well. Thanks, y'all.
Okay, so Christopher, hoping that you can talk a little bit more about how the U.S. Department of Transportation has been thinking about equity and what equitable development looks like, more specifically in part because when we think about the infrastructure funding, the majority of the dollars that we're talking about will actually be allocated to the U.S. Department of Transportation and DOTs across the state. And so if you can talk a little bit more about both DOT's action plan on equity and some of the work that you all are thinking about when we have a conversation around equitable development, that would be helpful.
Well, first, hello, Stephanie. It's so good to see you. And hello, Spark. I would just say, I remember when you guys were just little pups meeting in some of your towns and seeing where you guys are and the evolution of the great work. Again, Christopher Coase, currently the Assistant Secretary for Department of Transportation, formerly with Smart Growth America, which has been a huge ally and supporter of this initiative. But really interesting enough, Stephanie, when you ask this question, I do consider this a moment, a full circle moment. Many of us, I see Shelly out there, Catherine, so many who were part of Reconnecting America, Smart Growth America. We had this idea that if we center people, communities, and create this alignment with the traditional transportation industry, we could actually transform transportation policy. And we learned a lot in the last 15 years. I agree. I think you agree, Shelly. We are in different places, but those principles still the same. So in my current role as Assistant Secretary for Policy, on day one, before there was even a conversation about an infrastructure package, the question at the table with the Secretary Buttigieg at the time was what is our policy framework? And what I'm here to tell you on day one, within our department, but also within the federal family, equity and climate was at the forefront. And from our perspective at Department of Transportation, it was not only at the forefront, we asked ourselves, equity is not a standalone, it's a principle. So when you ask the question of what is equitable development, we have to actually go back, what is equity? And it's an honest assessment of where we are with the vision of how do we get to a country where everywhere, no matter who you are, where you live, you can live in a thriving place where it doesn't matter what your zip code is, you can actually have a promising life and actually maybe create generational wealth. Or in many cases, take away the harm that has been created previous years. So from that standpoint, the Department of Transportation did a couple things. Number one, we actually added equity as part of our strategic plan. And that is important because, as you know, when it comes to government, strategic plan is what decides what goes in performance plans, what decides what goes in budgets. And I tell people, if you're in government, don't ask what you care about, let me see your budget. And because of that anchoring of the policy framework, you then begin to see some of these principles actually end up in a bipartisan infrastructure law. Again, with $650 billion, which significantly $350 billion would go through states, DOTs, a significant would be at the Department of Transportation. But because equity is a forefront of our initiative, you have key programs that are trying to address injustices that we see in the built environment. For example, right now, we know that 40,000 individuals in this last year died on our roadways. And predominantly, those were Black and brown communities, those were rural places, and those were trouble. Those are moms, those are dads. As someone who is a son of a mother who was hit by a drunk driver and was made disabled, I understand that from a lived experience. We now have $5 billion where we can actually go out to those Black and brown communities, to those rural communities and tribal communities and say, for the first time, instead of waiting for state DOTs to prioritize you, we're going to put $1 in where communities have prioritized in need. The second element to that, and you called out our equity action plan, we actually identify 4 key principles that is actually the bedrock of how we approach equity through the Department of Transportation. First of which is the power of community. For too long, transportation planning has not been a table where the entire community, all voices, have been able to be not only welcomed, but actually heard, right? You guys can nod with me. And this is a moment for us, Department of Transportation, where we're saying, okay, within the power of community and our initiative here is that we're going to work directly with state DOTs, directly with NPOs, and give them the tools they need to actually open up the transportation planning process. Again, $350 billion are going to help create new roads, potentially new transit opportunities in these communities. If you're not asking the community what they need now, then we may not actually be successful. And so from that, as it was noted earlier, the Department of Transportation, working with my great champion, Irene Marion, we just released a new guide called Public Engagement Guidance, which is state DOTs and NPOs will be using, and really just setting our bar of what it means to have power community. The second key element of our equity strategy is increasing access. And one of the things that we find when you look at data, the fact of the matter is, in too many communities, when you talk about economic development and equitable economic development, you have to ask, what is the quality of the neighborhood? What's the ability of having affordable housing if you have to spend half of your income trying to get to your job, to healthcare? And we saw that in COVID, particularly at the Department of Transportation. Where we saw the highest COVID rates were places where people had high costs of living, lack of access to healthcare, to jobs, as well as other civic ecosystems. So from our perspective, we recognize that we need to prioritize our investments to help reduce transportation costs and increase access. And that's why we were excited that the bipartisan infrastructure law gives us one of the most historic investments, not only in public transportation, but also in expansion of passenger rail to address that. The third key metric strategy of our equity work is creating wealth in Black and brown and rural communities who have been under-resourced for too long. And how we're doing that? Well, first and foremost, of course, as a Department of Transportation, we have to walk the walk. And as some of you may be aware, through the Department of Transportation, we procure. We actually go out and get services. And also, we have to work with state DOTs as well as with our number of transit agencies to set DBE, Disadvantaged Business Enterprises standards. So from our perspective, we came in early on and said, you know what? 18% is not good enough for us. We're going to go beyond that. So what we said, in one fiscal year, can we get to 18? Can we go from 18 to 20%? And I can knock on wood, based on the latest intel, I think we're going to exceed that. And that is a testament to the type of team that we have. Now, of course, we're going to be working with a number of other partners across the country to actually follow our footsteps. Now, the last thing I'll say here is, in part of our equity strategy is intervention, because we understand that it's not just enough about having money on the ground, giving to state DOTs, transit agencies, and communities. It's not enough to say you're going to try to increase access. It's not enough to say, hey, we're going to create moments of access. You actually have to roll up your sleeves. And one of the things that we have learned as a department, and this is one of the reasons why having a diverse staff, people who bring different perspectives from across the country to the table, we all listened and heard from the community directly. It's like, the federal government hasn't been here. And so one of the things that we decided to do, we went to Congress and said, look, we need $30 million so that the federal government, particularly the Department of Transportation, working in partnership with HUD, can roll up our sleeves and introduce a new federal community partnership, now known as the Thriving Communities Initiative. And through that, we're going to be giving directly to community groups, working in partnership to their local government to actually help you co-design your projects that could then be eligible for this bipartisan infrastructure law. This is just a tip of the iceberg of the work that we're doing. And I will say that the last part here is what makes Spark so awesome is that the work you guys have been doing for the last 6 years, and I would say probably some years before that, is the reason why now when we look at our FY21 dollars, and particularly this last round of FY22 first year bill infrastructure, I can say emphatically that the framework and the work that you guys are doing are ensuring that we are putting dollars in the communities who need it most. For example, we put 70% of our raised dollars, which is our most popular discretionary point, 70% of our dollars went to historically disadvantaged and areas of persistent poverty. When you look at our freight program, communities are coming with transformative projects. For example, we just gave $105 million to the city of Detroit and the state Michigan DOT to help reimagine I-375. These are just examples of the work that folks like you are doing and presenting to us. And I think it is an awesome moment for us at Department of Transportation to really center equitable development in a way where we didn't have the resources before, but we can match money with the effort.
I deeply appreciate the conversation, and can we just give an applause, because I think that we don't really understand what systems change looks like. But over the last 6 years, we spent a lot of time having that conversation, and it does require for folks to shift, to do work in a different way, to connect with government. And I want to give a shout out to Maria Zimmerman, who is now with your team. So when we talk about the diversity of the ways in which even the Biden administration has been taking in and the ideas and the conversations, it has been in part because of the seeding of the work that people have been doing at every level. And in many ways, even the work that the Elevated Chicago had been doing on its local ordinance related to equitable development and having those conversations at the most localized levels are partly informing many of the technical assistance strategies that you all are implementing today. So deep appreciation to the ways in which the leadership has been happening. And we know that for this work to actually play itself out, it actually has to happen at the ground level. And I'm going to turn to Sissy to really have a conversation, because I think over the last 2 years, you really have been working in a very different way. When Spark first started, what we were really talking about were collaborative tables and coming together with various groups. And in this moment, what we've seen is that many of the groups have now turned into grassroots intermediaries. You all have turned into movement intermediaries, and you all have actually taken on federal resources, state and local resources, and part in a response to the global health pandemic that we had to engage in. And I think it then fostered a different type of conversation for many of the smaller entities that we never thought could really kind of take on or play this role, to say, actually, we are just as qualified, if not more positioned, to have a conversation with community and to be the service providers in a very different way. But that has also come with its own barriers and challenges. So Sissy, I was hoping that you could both ground us in what equitable development looks like to you in this season, but also the lessons that you've learned through the COVID response and the ARPA funding that you all have been able to receive from the county.
Okay. So when we were talking about Spark and my memory of Spark was 6 years ago in DC when we were living under an Obama administration. Life has changed a lot for all of us. The trauma of the Trump years, and then pandemic, and then now who knows, right? And it's been kind of like weird, right? To be quite honest, like I'm like, oh my God, what was 6 years ago like? It just felt like a very different world. And I say that because, we've seen like fascism rise in our country and be normalized. A lot of people are like, well, it's just a difference of opinion. And I'm like, no, it's a line in the sand, right? And then on top of that, okay, I'm like, okay, cool. Responding to the pandemic, right? So we started out as a youth organizing group with a budget of about $250,000 in 2019, right? And then we became a COVID relief organization in March 16th of 2020. Part of the reason we did that was simply because LA County wasn't translating documents into Chinese, right? Rare language, right? And they had no strategy for how to do outreach to people who did not have access to tech, right? How many of you guys have grandparents that you're like, want to tear your hair out whenever they ask you? Yeah, now imagine like thousands of them knocking on your door and being like, what is this thing called COVID, right? And so overnight, we started distributing food. We started distributing public health materials from Orange County's public health department, because they actually translated documents, right? And then over the course of the pandemic, also distributed PPE, groceries, rental assistance, all of these different things, simply because our public sectors weren't equipped to deal with low-income seniors who don't have documents and don't read and write English and don't know what the internet is. Like, we freaking ran a vaccine clinic. The last time I took a public health class was in high school. When they teach you like don't have sex, like that's the extent of my knowledge. But the reason we ran it was because our residents couldn't access getting vaccinated, even though the largest vaccine site was just up the hill from us at Dodger Stadium. This is the largest vaccine distribution site in the country. But because you need to have a car to be able to get vaccinated, and our folks don't drive, right? And so then all of a sudden, all of these federal programs and state and county programs over and over again created all these barriers because they were designed by people who live on the West Side, who can drive, who can work from home, and who have access to tech and speak and read and write English, right? And are well documented, as opposed to low income folks, people who don't have their immigration papers. You know, that's why we kind of did all of these things. And over again, every time I would talk to our public officials, they would be like, well, can't you do this? And I was like, no. Can you do this? No, right? And it was not because we didn't want to, but because the system wasn't set up to help our most vulnerable residents, right? And over again, there were just all these barriers. And that's just our experience with the pandemic, right? I think now we're in this phase where we're also kind of trying to look towards the future. We're still doing pandemic relief. You know, FYI, my public health knowledge, I've become our resident epidemiologist at our organization. More people have died of COVID this year than they have in 2020. So get vaccinated, get your booster. So for us, like, you know, going back to equitable development, Chinatown was created before redlining as a tool, as a part of a containment policy, to dump all the undesirables into one area, right? And so that's why, you know, our regional freeway system, the first freeways were built through Chinatown, right? Our transit hub, right, Union Station, was built on top of Chinatown specifically to demolish Chinatown. And then our regional prison system is there. You know, we're the most polluted neighborhood in LA, and actually top 1% most polluted in the state. You know, and a lot of this is intentional, right? As all of our communities that we work in, they're intentionally building infrastructure on top of us, right? To destroy us and to make us ill. And yet they keep saying, and over the decades they have said, and I say they, I mean the government, right? And the decision makers, they're saying it's gonna bring jobs, it's gonna bring economic development, it's gonna bring opportunity. It doesn't, right? Historically, what has happened is our folks have not been able to access those jobs or those contracting opportunities or any of the, you know, proposed economic developments because language, tech, and documentation, right? And so then for us, you know, earlier this year, we actually successfully got our county to establish an affordable housing land bank with the idea of finally $50 million, with the idea that infrastructure could potentially be harmful, right? In the case of our communities in LA, it's gonna bring gentrification, displacement, and then for our residents, homelessness, right? Because most of our residents are super poor and can't afford a $4 rent increase. And so how do you be predictive? We know that transit and infrastructure can bring benefits, but we also know that it can bring harm, right? A lot of real estate speculators come and see opportunity and then they start buying up property and kicking people out. So how do we get ahead of that? How do we prevent that from happening, right? And so that's part of the tool of the land bank, is to intentionally prevent displacement from happening in areas where we see infrastructure is coming in. And so this whole process has been really fascinating to learn, because we've been talking to different county agencies and getting a sense of, like, you know, there's this huge divide between the grassroots tiny groups like ours and then the agencies, and how money gets channeled down that pipeline, right? And so for us, we were like, we need to make sure that this money comes with funding to support local groups to do community engagement and outreach. Well, our government agencies were like, well, that's a problem, because that might actually create issues around fair contracting and transparency, right? And I was like, that is true, but you don't want a group, you know, for those of you who've been to LA, you know it's huge, right? You don't want a group that's on the West Side to be coming into like Boyle Heights or to Pacoima or to Chinatown and doing community engagement, right? So how do you support the groups in Boyle Heights and Pacoima and Chinatown to do that, right? And so one of the things that we've been trying to play around with is intermediaries, right? talking to the larger organizations that have the capacity to do county contracting or city contracting, to be the door openers, essentially, right? Like a lot of these intermediaries have historically been like gatekeepers, but I think that they should be the ones like that, welcome you, sort of like the staff at the hotel last night, right? Like opening the doors and orienting you, right? And I say this because in some cases, there's gonna be communities where there's only one volunteer-based or, $50,000 a year annual budget organization. We're not going to have the time or the capacity to build them up to be able to be county contractors, right? So how do we get the money quickly, especially if shovels are going to hit the ground on these transit projects or these like river projects or whatever, right? But also like, it's a lot of work to build up that capacity. And maybe what's more cost efficient is the intermediaries handle all the contracting and then the actual engagement happens with the local grassroots. And I'll give you an example is during the pandemic, one of the organizations that we actually worked with was Little Tokyo Service Center. They actually reached out to us and they wanted to apply for some funding that was being paid for by the CARES Act to do COVID outreach. Now, Little Tokyo, like the Japanese American community isn't the most high risk. But the reason they wanted to reach out to us was they knew Chinatown was super high risk. And they wanted to be the fiscal intermediary to give us access. And then they also brought in LA Community Action Network, which organizes housed and unhoused residents in Skid Row. So they were intentionally choosing, like, we're gonna step in, and even though we don't need this money that much, if it gives you guys opportunity to do the work in your neighborhoods, then we're gonna do it, right? And I'll say, like, I am so grateful for them because there was so much reporting, and so many issues. Even though CARES Act was at the federal level block grants, the way it trickled down to the county was like the county just added all these requirements that were not in the federal statutes. And they were asking all of these things of us. At one point, they asked us for a level of insurance coverage that would have eaten 90% of our grant.
And I want to point this out for the feds that are in the room, because I feel like particularly when these conversations happen, folks don't really understand what it takes to actually receive this level of funding. And I think one of the things that we learned very intentionally from Spark was, in addition to the tables that were being established, it was really about the rooted civic infrastructure that we were building out. And in many ways, we're still building on that lasting infrastructure. I think the other piece is that we know that foundation money can only take us but so far, but it's the relationship work that continues long after. And so groups like the Chicago Community Trust, the San Francisco Trust, right, Foundation offered a space for groups in various regions to really tap into a different way of connecting with their community foundations, Denver Community Foundation being one of those original as well. And I think it offered a space for a deeper connection, but also a deeper intentionality of what it meant to support some of the regional tables that were happening. And so, Khan, I was hoping that you could share a little bit more about what you all have learned over the last few years, particularly because of the pandemic, but in general, from the San Francisco Foundation, how equitable development really looks like, especially because you all have really seen the impact in a very different way. And while this conversation really is about leveraging and unlocking the federal resources, we also recognize that there are resources at every level that we have to really figure out. And how do we ensure that there aren't these gatekeeper effects and that we're fostering the level of relationship work that's needed to meet this moment?
Great. Well, thank you again. It's been incredibly inspiring the last couple of days to get to know you all. I'm a little bit mad at you because having to go after these three folks on the panel, they've said most of it already, Stephanie, right? So I'll try to focus on the things that we try to do and how we showed up that was a little bit different. One is we really try to support community in helping to understand that the money that's coming in, the $3.1 trillion you referenced, right? The money that needs to be spent out in the next 4 years, that money is one-time money. So it's really important and critical in how we think about how we're going to expend that money and how we use it in a way that is going to build permanent infrastructure for the community long-term. Because let's not fool ourselves, right? That money is not going to come around anytime soon. This is like one time, once in a lifetime opportunities, and we are smart enough to do it in that way. I think the second thing also is we at the Community Foundation were really concerned about the narrative that was being brought up around how government money was being spent. The fraud and the PPP fraud and government inefficiency. The opposition was really taking that narrative and trying to use it as a tool to prevent us from being ours, right? They were trying to say, no, this is why we can't give money to community. This is why we can't give it to Black and brown folks. So the Community Foundation really worked with community to really develop tools to really fight that narrative and being really intentional about the way we talk about things, right? Like, don't call Black and brown people vulnerable. No, Black and brown people have been targeted. They've been exploited. They've been systematically blocked from resources. That's why we're in the situation that we're in now. So don't call us vulnerable. And those are the types of messages that we are trying to really lift up so that, you know, we get the support of the community in a really deep way. The third thing that we try to really think about is the advocacy. Policy advocacy, systems change is critical to this work now. And at the San Francisco Foundation, we fund C4s, we fund PACs, we help to build the kind of advocacy infrastructure now so that it is ready to take this on into the future. I mean, that's gonna be critical, right? Like, we need to be at the table forming the policies so that we aren't chasing it at the back end, as you kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, Stephanie. And then maybe the last thing I might say about this is really about providing the tools for accountability, right? So making sure that the data is easy to see, easy to understand, easily accessible. We have an ARPA recovery tool similar to what you developed for the Southern region. So that gives our advocates and our partners the tools that they need to go to the council members and go to their electeds and say, hey, why the hell was 100% of our ARPA money spent to backfill cops? Like, that is not okay. And why is it that no money was given to, and you can't find that information easily, right? So I think for us, we're trying to help develop tools that really help provide more transparency and help our partners and advocates kind of speak up and speak out.
Thank you so much. One of the things that we also learned very quickly as we started to come together and really identify more of a national piece that connected us all together was really the conversation around supporting investment without displacement. And it's interesting, Sissy, because I feel like you were part of the parks conversation. You were part of we've had a lot of different conversations within Spark, but I think what it really kind of speaks to, especially 2020, because we all became racial equity experts, global pandemic epidemiologists. We took on a lot of different roles, but that's the role that community plays in many ways, right? Because we don't have a choice to really live a single issue life, right? The reality is that all of these things have a compound effect upon us when we really think about the work. And so it does require a level of intentionality. So I really wanted us to maybe come back to both the accountability conversation, and I'm actually going to start with you, Christopher, and this is going to be a lightning round before we go to the audience. But, you know, it's been really powerful to hear President Biden take an all-of-government approach around racial equity, around climate, and also around making sure that there's a commitment towards Justice 40, and more specifically, making sure that particularly with climate benefits, that there is a level of accountability with federal resources. And, you know, we often go back and forth because I share with you that while I appreciate Justice 40, I'm here for Liberation 100, that all federal funding will be used to ensure that it is not creating harm, that we are being intentional and accountable for every dollar to center community, and that we are building in such a way that we're moving more than just benefits. It's really about investments, right? Whether it's at the federal level or the state or regional, that there's a level of accountability for the funding in a way that we don't at the back end have to do a level of advocacy. But I know DOT has taken that charge very intentionally, both through the Thriving Network, Thriving Communities Network, and also the Justice 40 plan. And so I was hoping that you could talk a little bit more about that. And then I'm actually going to go to you, Jenny, to talk a little bit about that accountability that you all have been then holding governments to at the state level.
Thank you for that, Stephanie. And we don't ever have a squabble. We generally agree. So for how many, by a show of hands, how many are aware of the Justice 40 initiative, just by a show of hands? Okay. For those who are not aware, the Justice 40 initiative is part of the president's executive order around the climate crisis, but specifically recognizing that we are going to make unprecedented resources available to fight the climate crisis, that those resources, those efforts, at least 40% of those investments should go down and benefit disadvantaged, underserved communities. How are we planning to achieve that? So early in the administration, every agency had to go through a process of identifying a disadvantaged community. Now, when you talk to our colleagues at EPA, HHS, this is not new to them. They've been part of the space. But for the Department of Transportation, this is new. Defining what a disadvantaged community outside what has been in our wheelhouse, which is like rural communities, we know that they're disadvantaged communities when it comes to transportation spending. Travel communities, we get that. But outside of that, that was not something that we were necessarily accustomed to having a definition around. And that was actually quite remarkable. Because within the Department of Transportation, we literally got our research teams, our civil rights teams. We went down to the bells of the MODES staff who are in the regions and asked ourselves, what are the key indicators from the lens of a transportation department would define as disadvantaged? And interesting enough, it was those same indicators that our colleagues at HHS would say, or EPA, lack of access, proximity to pollution. And then for us, it became more of a suite of indicators that basically said, if we remove the harm, this would actually be a thriving community. So for us, Justice 40 became a roadmap of how should we be thinking about our investments, our technical assistance, or our policy in communities when we show up. So that was the first moment of conversation for us. So now we have our map. We have our Justice 40 map for the Department of Transportation, which we've been working in collaboration with DOE. And now we're doing the next exercise. For Department of Transportation, we've identified over 39, technically 40, but 39 official programs totaling over $200 billion. Now, with that, technically 40% of the investment should go to disadvantaged communities. But here's the kicker. The language is not investment. So Stephanie, you say the dollar. I think a lot of people pay attention to the dollar. Where is the dollar going? And yes, we're tracking that, but we're taking it a step further. Because just because you put a dollar in a community doesn't necessarily mean it actually provides a benefit. And if it does bring a benefit, who does it benefit? Who is benefiting the most, right? And so we are asking ourselves, not only from a policy standpoint, from a programmatic standpoint, but actually to our grant recipients. When you are applying for these dollars, you can say, yes, my project or my transit line or my bike path is in a Justice 40 community, but we want to know, well, who's benefiting from it? Are you addressing the indicators that we identified? Are you creating more wealth for that within that community? And we want you to speak to it, because if you do, you're more likely to be competitive to our programs. The second piece of that is now the part that's going to be the hardest. Because the key aspect of Justice 40 is, and for our lifetime of the administration, the next couple of years that we're here, is making sure the dollars are getting to the places and we're tracking that they're getting there and they're structured in a way. The real power of Justice 40, as I said before, if you have 10 or 20 indicators that triggers this disadvantage, can you trace the dollar that's going to those communities in the policy framework centered, community-driven centered? Are you removing the harm? And that is going to take time, and it's going to require a long-term partnership with the community, with the local government, with private sector, with philanthropy, and that is where we need you. Because we can't do this on our own. Our job is now to put the dollars in your hands, but it's also a requirement of making sure the partnerships on the ground are steadfast, that they actually can turn those investments into the transformation, so that when we come back, I don't have any more Justice 40 communities. That there is not a community that has harm, because we either fix it or we're creating more thriving communities for people, because we actually do have a crisis. The places that are thriving cost too much. because we do not have enough great, thriving communities that are accessible for all. And that is our job as a Department of Transportation, working in concert with EPA, working in concert with HHS, working in concert with HUD to make sure that our resources are helping create that. And so that's the opportunity that we have at Justice 40, but also it's an open invitation because it requires a federal and community and local partnership to get it done.
And I want to speak specifically because I think while DOT has done some great leadership work within the administration and interagency family, the reality is that 90% of the funding that I was talking about ultimately is going to be decided by states. And so there's a level of accountability that also has to happen. And in this moment, many governors have not necessarily even set a priority around their infrastructure funding. And so it's critical for us to really get a better sense of how are these governors actually going to be spending the dollars and holding them accountable to set a similar executive order framework that offers this level of accountability. I know, Jenny, you all have been really doing a little bit more of that research to really do a scan, and you started with ARPA to look at that conversation. I was hoping that you could maybe highlight some of the pieces that you've seen as the lessons learned, particularly that we could take from ARPA to apply to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding that is flowing through to places now.
Thanks. So one of the biggest things, and to Sissy's point, our organization did turn into a catch-all, right? From our initial conversation of we're going to be supporting policy to, Jenny, we got to start distributing food to South Florida. And I'm like, oh, okay, let's do that. Sure. To also then becoming a hub for people to come get this information. So when the American Rescue Plan came about, we developed a toolkit that provided folks with actual things that they can use. This is for our local government so that they can utilize it, and to our community. So we increased our community engagement by actually producing a community engagement guide. We did a report highlighting hefty sections of cities that local leaders can look up for real-time examples. That's on our dashboard. We also have an activist playbook, a how-to guide to access community activists and nonprofits in connecting and engaging with their local leaders and elected officials. We had the funds tracker that's available on our website, theseep.org, that had a dashboard to collect real-time data of what was happening, how money has been spent, and providing model resolution, which folks here in Louisiana actually utilized. And so we really wanted to make sure that we were providing people with what we needed. But on top of that, what was the community saying, right? Again, we're not an organization that's going to tell you what to do and how to do it. We're going to ask what's going on. And we did a community needs survey and found that folks had the top 5 challenges: ability to pay utilities, employment opportunities, access to and ability to maintain affordable housing, personal debt, reliable internet access. Everything can't be on the internet, y'all, if not everybody has internet, right? We can't continually tell people just apply and you'll be okay. So we have to have options for them, and we have to make sure that we as an organization, we as humans, we as people are helping them. Y'all, I'm a whole educated lady. I had a very hard time getting my parents scheduled for their vaccine in 2021. A tough time. I was like, is the internet broken? That's hard for me, somebody who is in this work, in this field, going and learning about this constantly, literally speaking the language. Imagine the folks who don't have the access, don't have the language, don't have the literacy to do this. We can't only put stuff online, but we also have to make sure that we're providing folks with opportunities like teletown halls. Are we getting on the phone and calling folks? Are we utilizing other tools like SMS texting, with their permission, of course, and providing them with tools that they can use there? So I think one of our biggest things that we are always trying to do at SEEP is provide folks with as much support as possible. And we're actually going to be, to your point about grants and opportunities, we're actually setting up a federal grants funding tool where folks like yourselves can actually go to our website and find grants that are available to your organizations, whether they're large or small, and how do you actually apply, right? Because it's not just advocacy for one side, it's advocacy on all sides. And so what we want to keep doing is be that bridge. That is what we are, to help all folks understand that this policy isn't supposed to be against us, it's supposed to be for us.
That's right. So now I want to kind of shift to the role of just leveraging the various resources, because while we are having a conversation about the federal dollars, the reality is there's a match that's required to unlock a lot of those resources. And Taj James formerly of Movement Strategy Center often says that philanthropy has a really powerful role to really use their millions and also the private sector's billions to unlock the trillions in this moment. I'm just saying. So, we've been.
She was dropping bars.
I really feel, and I give it to Taj. What I would say in this moment, though, is that there is a real opportunity for the role of philanthropy. And when I think about Spark, there was a large learning space graciously offered through our funders, whether it was really thinking about Ford holding us accountable around racial equity and was very explicit that this was not an equity journey, this was a racial equity journey, and that we needed to have a conversation. And when we were sitting in Schaumburg 6 years ago, there is no way that we had an anti-Black framework for the conversation. But then when we got to California and they were like, this is not a Black and white issue, this has to be a different type of conversation, it shifted the way that we did our work and had our discussions. And even just thinking about the social determinants of health conversation that really grounded us in a very different way, in part because of the folks at Robert Wood Johnson, who was holding us accountable to all types of evaluation frameworks, but forced us to have a different way of thinking about this work. And I think so when you all start to talk about Justice 40, it's powerful because you have a Maria Zimmerman who's bringing in an intersectional conversation that we all had to go through because of Spark. And it was very hard to blend those different conversations as we talked about race and climate and health. But this is where we are actually seated in this moment. And so I just wanted to turn to you, Khan, because I feel like, even with Kresge, like the arts and cultural work and what we got through Enterprise and we had a lot of intentionality that was put within Spark that I don't think people really understood. And it was very hard to hold, but it was all of the pieces that you needed to be able to braid the conversations that we're having today in this moment. And so even though the funders went with us on this quirky journey, it included California Endowment, it included so many community foundations, I think what it did offer us was a space to have a very different generational conversation that brings together all the pieces that are required because we don't have single issued lives. So as I think about in this moment, how do we shift from a moment to a greater movement? And I'll have some more thoughts about that later. I'm hoping that you can talk about the role that you get to sit in from a place, honestly, of privilege.
Absolutely.
And the investments that can happen in supporting place.
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. I think one of the things about the San Francisco Foundation is that we are a racial equity and economic opportunity organization, and we look to center community in the work. And the pandemic, the racial reckoning, the last 2.5 years has really asked us to question ourselves about how we can build back better, and what does that really mean, and what is actually different. And one of the things that our community has called us into is really to serve almost as like a social justice intermediary, right? Like, yes, we're grant makers. That's part of our ethic, but how are we stepping into our power or our role as a convener and as a facilitator? And how do we make sure that we are being a data provider? And how do we make sure that we're being a systems engineer and deal maker? And then most importantly, like a capacity builder. I was getting a little bit mesmerized by what Chris was saying a little bit over there, right? Like Policy Wonk, so he's talking about how we remove all these harms and ask all these questions, and community's gonna have to justify exactly how they're gonna get rid of this. And I'm like, oh damn, that's like 10 more pages of grant writing.
Not true. Not true.
Hold him to this, okay? Hold him to this.
I'm gonna bring that back on that.
Because I'm gonna make sure that what you're doing is not creating a situation where now I have to then fund a bunch of more technical assistant providers and grant makers so that they can fill it out. And as you mentioned, like the reporting is really challenging, right? So I think for us, we're really trying to really think through what it is that how we need to transform. How do we leverage our principle? We went to our board multiple times to get extra opportunities to pull out from our principle to invest in the way it needed to. The other thing is we also we're from Silicon Valley. So we worked with our corporations and really try to think through how we can call them to the table, right? Because this is work that all of us needs to be involved in. And we asked them to think about how we can better leverage their treasury. You know, like they have a huge portfolio. Most of it doesn't even require any return. Like they've earmarked a certain amount of their portfolio to have a 0% return. How can we leverage that money now in this time to build our community?
So I'm smiling because I remember when we started the journey, we were like, Spark is a $90 million investment in 6 regions across the country. And it was like 90, where did these numbers add up? And we were talking about PRI funds, program-related investment from philanthropy. We were talking about some of these loans, and I have to give a shout out to the Elevated Chicago table. We were in Seattle at the time, and they were like, if you all are talking about race and racial equity more explicitly, how can you have this conversation and then talk about saddling community with debt financing as part of that conversation? And I was like, oh, because Spark was intended not just to transform the communities, but also all of the entities that was working with Spark.
Yeah.
And we all got better as a result. Our strategies got better. We were talking, I mean, I got to give a shout out to, we were having accessory dwelling conversations in Denver before it was a real, not that it wasn't happening, but there were different types of land trust conversations that were happening very early on, where our strategies have changed so much in these last 6 years. And Sissy, I'm just looking at you because it's funny that you're like, we existed in 2019 as a 200, because you were leading a lot of the equitable parks conversation and the equitable development conversations in a very different way when we started to talk about investment without displacement. And so I was hoping that you could give a little bit more, particularly as we have a conversation even with philanthropy throughout the journey. New funders came along, great gratitude to Ballmer and others who helped to shift us. But there was also a different conversation that we had to have because you all pushed us. And again, what we had was this beautiful theory of change that had, we were going to help what was happening at the national go local, and what happened locally come up to the national. And it was a tornado at times. It was an adventure of pushing and pulling for accountability. So I was hoping, Sissy, you could talk a little bit more about even just the learnings, right, that you have seen in this moment and the evolution when we have this conversation about equitable development, rooting it in the realities of community. Because I think even for the national entities like the NRDCs, the enterprise, the of course, LIFT, the Low Income Investment Fund, as part of this, we all were part of a journey. And I have to shout out the San Francisco Fed because they were really part of our data journey as well to get us together, and Karen Chappell and others. Can you talk a little bit about what you feel like you've learned on this journey and what you're taking away as we then shift from this moment to a greater movement?
So at our first 2 convenings, right? So this was DC and New York. Parks and green gentrification were not on the conversation list at all. The focus was completely on transit, and I was not having it. You know, when she talks about tornadoes, that's me. And so I was just basically pulling people from the different cities that were involved in the Highline Network. So those of you who don't know, the Highline Network is a collection of, I don't know, maybe about 20 different green infrastructure projects, including the Atlanta Beltline, the Chicago 606, and of course the New York High Line, right? And these were basically projects designed to gentrify neighborhoods. Whether they started out that way, that's how a lot of them ended up, right? And so I started talking to the folks in Atlanta, and she's like, what's going on with the Beltline? And they were like, it's terrible. And then I started talking to the Chicago folks, you know, about the 606, and they were like, it's terrible. Like in the in-between spaces, right? Coffee breaks and stuff, because I wasn't supposed to talk about green gentrification, but I did. And that's kind of how the Park Equity Group got started, was I just basically pushed the conversation. And I don't know, for those of you who are around for New York, there was a tour of the High Line. And, you know, the Ford Foundation brought in Robert Hammond to talk about how great of a model of like equitable development this was. Mind you, Robert Hammond said that there are no poor people living near the High Line. There's 2 public housing projects a block away. I was like, how, what the fuck? Public housing people are poor by definition, right? Like, how can you say there's no poor people in New York City, right? so like that was just kind of where Spark was at when, you know, I started. And I just said, no, I'm going to just do my own thing because, you know, for us in Chinatown, we are next to the LA River, right? And so the LA River was going to see like billions of dollars in reinvestment. And everybody was like, this is going to be great. It's going to green all these really historically polluted neighborhoods. We had a mayor at the time who was like, we want the good gentrification, not the bad, you know, like just kind of a little bit clueless. And I wanted to learn from these other cities. And so I took advantage of Spark and the opportunities that it came. And then eventually the national team was like, I guess we're just going to have to deal with Sissy by creating a whole new working group.
It was a beautiful adventure. I just want you to say it wasn't a problem. It helped us to get better. I wanted to also bring the conversation grounded a little bit more in the lived experience of community. And I want to shout out the Memphis table because I think that Justin, under his leadership, has really centered Black joy and what it means for community to do this work. And when you think about the Spark original sites, Atlanta, Memphis, Chicago, Denver, LA, and the Bay Area, those are very different size places and cities to have the conversation. And so it's beautiful for you to share that there was still a learning space between and in LA because of the size conversation. I think in this moment, administration has been very intentional about saying that they want to focus on small and mid-sized places that typically don't get the resources like a Chicago, like an LA, like a San Francisco. And in many ways, we were testing out what does a hybrid model. We didn't realize it at the time. Let me not take credit for any of those pieces. But I'd say the collective, we did have to figure out a learning space and a learning community in a very different way. And the culture between the North and the South and what that conversation would look like was a very hard conversation to manage. And so Jenny, I feel like particularly because you're sitting in the Gulf South, but in the greater kind of Southern strategy, which is really a new evolution for this conversation, and not because investing in the South is new, but because of the ways in which you have to do engagement work in the South has to lead with a different level of intentionality. Can you share, not even from your reports, but just from the things that you have learned over these last few years, both what you see as the opportunity for this moment, and again, I'm going to shift to what does this mean for the collective movement?
Yeah, so one thing for sure, I'm Dominican from New York, and I moved to the South, which they don't know what Dominican is. On top of that, when you go in specifically Georgia, right? That's my lived experience. I live in Georgia. I've been there now 22 years. You can't even notice. But there's a difference between Atlanta and Georgia. Okay? There's 159 counties in Georgia, and about 120 are considered rural. And so when we're having conversations in the South, I think a lot of times people, especially in bigger cities, especially in the North, especially in the West, they're like, things move real slow. Yeah, things are slower, but y'all, social movements have been happening in the South for a very, very, very long time. When it happens in the South, that's when people start noticing. Okay. Georgia turned into a flip state because people were noticing, okay? Mm-hmm. No one thought it would happen, but it did. Okay. And so I think it's important and valuable to this idea of like, yes, we do need to be a little bit more intentional, but be intentional, right? Like when people come to visit, a lot of folks haven't visited Mississippi. Mississippi different, y'all. It's different from everything, how you speak, how you move, how you interact. But we went there, right? We did. I went to Mississippi. I never thought I would because, again, I'm from New York. We just saw that stuff on TV. But actually being there gives you a different realm of how do you interact. And again, it's not by telling people, it's actually asking, how can we help? That's like our motto. How can we help? How can we be a part of this and not step on people's toes? How do you actually invite people in the conversation? We shouldn't keep having convenings in the larger cities. We know how to get there. But y'all, if you're talking about the infrastructure bill and you're talking about access to Wi-Fi, go to South Georgia, 2 hours outside of Atlanta, and you can't get service for 28 miles. There is no gas station for 27 of those 28 miles. And I was on E by myself in a place that I didn't know. And I was like, they're not gonna know I'm Dominican. This is gonna be a problem. And so it's really important for us that if we are talking about intentionality and we are talking about we need to see this, then invite them. Look at yourself. What do you look like? Who are you? What do you bring? What's your privilege? And invite people that are complete opposites of you, right? We all have differences. And I think we kind of sit in that, well, we're advocating for the people, so we'll be okay. Bring the people in, y'all, and go to the people, go to these places. Every single state that is here has a rural part of their state. Have you been to it? Have you engaged with the people there? Have you really been an activist to say, I want to activate these people in my state because they all matter, not just my metropolitan area? So that was my soapbox.
Thank you. We appreciate it. And I was hoping to, Christopher, offer space for you, because I think that when we have had this conversation about what investment looks like in place, who is supportive of it, the reason why we have had this conversation and are centering with the federal government, again, is the magnitude of resources that are going to come down the pipe, the intentionality of this administration and the work that needs to happen. But I also want to highlight the importance of these next few weeks that are going to come, in part because things may change. And it does require even the most committed to still be accountable in a very different way, because there will be others who may be asking for a different level of accountability from you all in this administration. And so I wanted to just give space as to how are you all institutionalizing this conversation? I think one of the things that we have had to reckon with Spark is we spent a lot of time thinking about how to do this work. We literally have a box that is filled with like 5,000 documents that y'all probably have seen 10% of it, just processing how do you do this work very intentionally. But then more importantly, none of this matters if we're not doing the institutional work to make sure that it's embedded long after we're gone. And so I was hoping that you could just give us a highlight, and then we'll turn to the audience, to how you all are thinking about institutionalizing the great work that you have shared, but also how to ensure that it's not undone once you all leave.
I had to take a breath because there was a lot that was said, and I want to jump in, and I realized I have a federal hat on, so apologies. So a couple things I'll say to this question, but then addressing some of the things I've heard so far. First and foremost, I think it is important for me to remind those who are listening in the room, but also online, that this idea of community-driven transportation projects that leads to equitable outcomes is not an idea that is like in the minority. This is actually an idea that is actually quite embraced, not only within rural town, and by my dear friend, I am from South Georgia. I am from Thomasville, Georgia. I am the rural town. And I would tell you, we have Wi-Fi. And the reason why I say that is because to your point about institutionalization, this work, Spark, right? You're 6 years old. But I also have to grant that there have been many predecessors to Spark, and predecessors to the organizations that who have been in the work. And I have a unique space that I occupy at the Department of Transportation where I see the applications come through. And I'm telling you, anyone tell you the secrets? I know I said too much. What I can tell you is that there is a movement, whether it's a small town in Mississippi, whether it's some Midwestern town, if it's Seattle, all the way to a small little town called Berlin, New Hampshire, where people are literally sitting around tables like this and are asking very important conversations like, how can we make our community better? How can we actually get greater access to jobs and opportunity? And interesting enough, they have different words, they have different languages, but they're all coming back to that same common values. And when you ask about institutionalization, one of the first things we recognize at Department of Transportation is recognizing that we can knit that together, because that's the coalition that allowed us to convince Congress and the American people to give us not only 1.2 trillion, but now the $400 billion to actually show that we can make these investments. So the first part of institutionalization is recognizing that the work has been done to get us to the point where we can actually make a historic investment. The question is, can we do it the right way and actually continue to show that the next 5 years, when we have a conversation again about, do we do another down payment on America that's aligned with the equity, climate, and economic transformational agenda, that it actually benefits everybody? That is the also institutionalization moment we have. The second point I'll point out, and now this is about the department. We are very conscious about how we see this as an investment, this 1.2 trillion plus the Inflation Reduction Act, as a moment for us to also rethink how we do business. So we have to hire almost close to 1,000 new staff. And so if you talk about institutionalization, it's also about the team that you're building. And I think I'm constantly reminded that almost 70% of our own workforce are retirement age. And so it's not just about institutionalization of the values, and like, it's actually a moment of organizational peril. If we're going to be able to deliver for the American people in a time where we're going to have climate crisis, disruption, economic disruptions, as well as the challenges that we're seeing in our communities, I need to make sure that before I leave, as well as with the secretary and across our federal agencies who are in this work, that we are leaving a federal government that can actually be able to do the work. The last piece here is something that the secretary says. Again, the secretary is a once-in-a-lifetime generational voice, and he says something so often that makes all of us kind of go, you're right, you're absolutely right. You know, it's funny, and the secretary would say something along the lines of, you know, it takes an act of Congress for him to come and testify, right? He has to go someone has to invite him to go talk to EPA, to the House or the Senate. But when it comes to American citizens, individuals in this room, when it comes to a NPO board meeting, when it comes to a local government meeting about transportation policy, when it comes to a state house meeting, when it comes about transportation budgets, you don't have to be invited. You can show up. And fundamentally, way our infrastructure investments, when it comes to the federal government down to community, it is literally about who shows up. And the point here is the institutionalization is not just about what the federal government can do better, what we can encourage our state DOTs and transit agencies to do better in best practices, and we're doing that work, but it also is the institutionalization of the citizenry. Are you going to keep showing up? Are you going to hold us accountable? Because it's not a top-down conversation. The top-down conversation is only when there's no one answering back and saying, this is what we need. And I think right now, that together is why I can sit here and say, at least while we're here, we're going to be opening our doors to hear the voices, influencing our policies, but also making sure the dollars are getting where they are. But also, I think this is one of those moments, like, I was one of you guys at some point. The question is, which one of you is going to sit in my chair?
Do we want to?
Yes, because if you are building the ecosystem and the institutionalization, we have to be prepared to have the next the local government DOT official, the local planner director, who's going to become the state DOT director, who's going to be head of the NPO, who one day might be a secretary of transportation or assistant secretary for transportation policy. Because we need these lived experiences in the room where decisions are being made and where the communities can be prioritized. And I say that to say, as someone who grew up in a Baptist church where it was important for the NAACP to meet in our basement to do voter registration and also, you know, do the building fund. Community shows up differently in different communities, but those experiences are informing all of us in the places that we sit. So I say that to say, that's how we are doing the institutionalization. We're taking bold action, but it also requires us to tell you, keep what you're doing and go more places, because we see the projects coming through the pipeline, we see your fingerprints. And so we say, march on.
Thank you. So now I want to shift to the audience and just to invite space for reflection on the journey. And I'm looking to Melissa in part because when we think about the Spark equitable development guide that has just come out, in many ways it was inspired because of both you and Dea. And so Dea, shortly after, know that I am going to be looking to you to give some thoughts as well for our remaining closeout. And Melissa's over there. While we wait for Melissa to get the mic, one thing that I will say is that really thinking about this question of how and what role we will play over time, I feel like is a critical one. It was interesting during my tenure at the Obama administration, Christopher was at a nonprofit and was holding me accountable in a very different way. So it's beautiful that the shift can happen. But in many ways, when I think about Spark and I look at this room, so many people are not here. And there are so many people who are here. And we have changed roles in so many ways over these 6 years. And even as we go on, I hope that our fingerprints and the lessons that we've learned together collectively will be ingrained, because we have put in a lot of time together. And it feels beautiful to be here for this homecoming. And yet I hope that there will be so much more that we'll be able to collectively do together. Melissa?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this panel. It's been incredible. I'm struck by what 6 years of flexible resources has done for particularly smaller organizations like yours or mine, starting at around the same size when we started. Being able to take what we knew we could see could be done and have the flexible resources to prove it could be done, to attract in the next set of funders that would help it grow. And I think that that's something that we need to figure out how to continue after Spark. And so for us in the Bay Area, one of the things that meant is that we had a community, a small sized city like you're talking about, that didn't see as much resources as other places. And in fact, for us in the Bay Area, saw the least resources of anywhere else in terms of the county, in terms of where we were. And we were able to use those initial investments from Spark to get some initial work going, some initial community efforts going, some initial community conversations about housing affordability going, that really we were able to roll into money that then became a Build Health Challenge and provided years of funding for community organizing around housing. And then that was able to be paired. And so the organizing there won a COVID-19 eviction moratorium, and before that won a temporary rent cap. And then now the TA that Spark provided allowed Northern California Community Land Trust to provide enough TA and practical support to bring in state money that's launching a land trust. And so I think all that comes from being able to get to those early flexible dollars. And so one of the things that I've been thinking as Spark ends is, what are the local community partners that do that early first in trust-based funding? And so it's great to see Con on the stage, because San Francisco Foundation has been that kind of funder over and over again for us and a lot of our partners. And so I think as we move into this next phase, I'm looking forward to working with partners across the country to help make that part of the wave of what gets funded.
Thank you.
Stephanie, can I actually add to what Melissa was saying too? So earlier this year, or like December of last year, we got $70,000 from Spark to do some rapid response kind of research that we leveraged into 50 million. So essentially what happened was we were targeting, the American Rescue Plan Act allocation for seed funding for our affordable housing land bank, right? And we had a very short window of about 6 months to do all the research, right? Like budgets, how many acquisitions, how many deals, what community partnerships could look like, all of that stuff. And we shopped around the concept to a lot of like local funders and state funders in California. And they were like, why isn't the county paying for this? And I was like, yes, they should, but they're not going to. Or if they do, then it's going to take 2 or 3 years, right? And it wasn't because of us. One of our partners is actually like Gary Partners. That's Gary's architecture firm. They are a county contractor. And if we had Gary to apply to get funding, it would have taken them 3 years. And they were already a county contractor, right? For us, if we were to apply, it would probably taken 5 years, right? But the window was closing very quickly on the ARPA money, right? And it's like one-time flexible dollars. That's like just the golden goose, right? And so Spark came in and gave us 70,000, and that was enough to basically do the research we needed to get to the 50 million. But had Spark not come, that wouldn't have happened, right? And so like, I feel like foundations need that, we need that flexible spending. It's not that we're throwing it out into the streets, it's just, it's leveraging opportunities that we can't predict, right? In like a year in advance or 2 years in advance, right? Like you have those annoying, you know, like grant reports and strategic plans that we have to do. And like, we have to guess where we're going to be in 3 years. And it was like, I can't guess where I'm going to be in 3 months. Every time I try, like it goes out the window. And so that flexible money, like there's no $50 million. That was a good return on investment.
I think so.
So for the Spark funders out there,
Thank you.
keep doing it.
Yeah. I wanted to make sure that Dea was able to add her voice into the space, in part because of the equitable development guide that got announced today and the learnings that came out of the Denver conversations.
No, thank you, Stephanie. And I just have to give a little bit more love and kudos to Melissa, because honestly, it was really her leadership, I think, that stewarded this entire process for Denver. We learned so much from the folks in the Bay Area and LA when it came to leveraging Spark dollars and really making it more than what could even be dreamt, even just by waving our own wands. I mean, we focus so much of our efforts on building community leadership and community capacity in Southwest Adams County, which is now flourishing and really taking on a life of its own. And community folks are really garnering some support and some more momentum around community ownership and community stewardship, really taking control of the land and ideally bringing down additional federal dollars. And then Renee and Jose here taking that little bit of seed funding back in 2020 from Mile High Connects and from Spark, and ultimately building it out, this amazing navigator cohort that is bringing down more and more federal dollars, even ARPA dollars. And we're just looking ahead to the future. I think one thing that's coming up for me, and Sissy, you kind of touched on this a bit, but the role of those grassroots intermediaries, and this is going to be a little bit of a question, actually. You know, so many organizations that serve in an intermediary role at the local level are multi-million-dollar organizations, often led not necessarily by communities of color or communities that are representative of those that are most impacted by COVID, by all of these health issues. So I guess I'm just kind of curious, and a challenge for us as we continue to build this kind of future of Spark and whatever this looks like. How do we shift the power from those very well-resourced intermediaries to the community groups who really are the ones on the ground? And how do we open up that space so that more small grassroots organizations like a Buku West, like a Center for Community Wealth Building, like others around this table are able to actually bring those dollars out and into community?
Personally, I think a lot of it, and it's interesting because I forget who I was having a conversation with earlier today about NRDC's role. I think it was Ella, in trying to kind of be better, right? Like NRDC, I'm quoting the NRDC staff I've talked to, right? Has had a history of like racial issues. I'll just say that. And how do we shift it away from that? And I think part of it is really, you know, a lot of different national organizations had this reckoning in 2020, right? Some are like over it, whatever. And then some are still doing it, and they're hiring all these DEI consultants, and they're kind of exploring like, we should go into communities. No, you should not. You should stay in your lane, do what's good, right? Which is draw down, be that bridge to the national funders, to the, and
Say that again. Can you say that one more time?
Be the bridge, since we're talking about infrastructure, right? Or the connector, right? And so NRDC shouldn't be going into communities. They should be the echo for local communities. Like, we say we need this, then you, with your connections to the Secretary of Transportation or whatever agencies or departments or national funders, Robert Wood Johnson, you know, you're the ones that are saying, this is what we're hearing, right? This is what these communities need. We are going to be willing to step in and play the fiscal sponsor, and we'll only take 10% for admin, but you know, we'll do all the reporting, whatever, provide the umbrella insurance, that kind of stuff, right? And that's the role, right? And so it's like, play to your strengths, right? Don't try to do something that you're not good at and that it's just going to come in and feel parachuting, right? And I feel like that's where those groups come in. And the reality is it shouldn't be on groups like ours to hold the large national groups accountable. It should be the other national, right? So like NRDC, if you're going on this journey, what are you doing about Sierra Club, right? Because I still remember when Sierra Club members tried to push for an anti-immigrant resolution across their membership. This is in California, right? I still haven't forgiven them, even though it's been like 20 years. You know, like what are you doing to hold accountable the other national partners so that they know how to partner meaningfully with local communities, right? Again, you're supposed to be the door opener, not the gatekeeper. So do that.
She might need your mic.
I would just add to collaboration is key here as well. A lot of folks, when the pandemic started, the Southern governors were just not about it, right? It was just very clear. Their opening, they did, that was it. But the Northern governors were like collaborating together. In response with that, SEEP actually started South Strong, which was a collaboration of over 200 scholars and organizational leaders to come together to see an equitable post-pandemic South. And so from there, it's sharing resources, it's providing webinars, it's having a coalition that actually is working together, a small organization. So if you all would like to get more, I mean, Denver's not the South, but every time I do meet somebody from Denver, they try to convince us. So we can have this conversation for sure. But I think definitely a collaboration mindset is what's needed, because the more of people that actually do things together, the more you can get some of those funds. And you can also visit our new grant tracker so you can apply to those grants that are available to smaller organizations.
So I'm getting the wrapping up signal. So I just wanted to close out by just acknowledging this moment. And while this moment in many ways is something that Spark had been created for, what I'm really kind of seated with is really the story of the bamboo and how it grows, which is that over its tenure, much of its roots actually bury down and it interconnects. And for some, it's a weed, honestly. But for others, it's really a transformative plant that is able to bend and not break as life circumstances come and take it. And I think in this moment, what we've been able to build through Spark is an interconnected, root-based system of groups across this country that I hope that we will stay connected with even after we close out, and start to forge what will be hopefully more of that shooting up. That's what makes it so powerful, is that in its third year, it grows 10, 15 feet tall for others to see what had been happening underneath. And when I think about what Christopher spoke to, and that the work that Spark was doing and did really stood on the legacy of so much other work that had been happening at the grassroots level. And that's always the case. For many of the initiatives, it kind of really comes from entities that have been doing this work in the long, drawn out hours where no one actually sees, but eventually it does come up and it becomes that example. Justice 40 came out of movement building work in New York for decades, but then got to a place where it became a national conversation through an election cycle and an accountability around that. And I think in this moment, what we have is an opportunity to really think about how we shift from this moment and make an investment for the greater movement, and really think about how do we foster these relationships and really ensure that we can be in community with each other. In part because correction does require connection, and it requires us to be in relationship in a very different way. And so as we close out, I just want to express my gratitude both to the larger Spark National team, our funders, local partners, our community, and really this Spark family that we've fostered over these last 6 years. As I started, and the mic wasn't open properly, what I will say is that even in this moment, as we sit at the Ashe Center, as a cultural bearer who does practice the art of remembering, the word Ashe is a Yoruba term, and it means, may it be so. And it speaks to the power and the opportunity that we have the opportunity to speak life And over these last 6 years, we have tried, we have dared, we have pushed, we've held ourselves to speak life over our communities. And in this moment, I see an opportunity in which this can shift from more of a generational opportunity into a place where our original hashtag was a place where we all thrive. And so as we close out, I would just like to say Ashe. May we live into the existence that we have stated that we wanted to when we first started this journey, where we could sit and ground ourselves leading with racial equity to ensure that we are really thinking about both our climate future and our public health future in a way that we all thrive. Thank you.